Our subconsciousness that we have to deal with tonight is just a little bit different, and we're going to go into an excursion, well, into Freud for a moment. And going back to all my years of teaching, I advanced immediately to the blackboard to explain Freud and his theory in, I trust, simple terms. As you know, he had much to do with dreams, but there was a 4th or 5th century, a pre-Christian century book written in Egypt on the subject of dreams. In the Middle Ages, there was a doctor, a philosophical doctor, who said that physicians were wont to examine the dreams of their patients in order to determine their character. But Freud brought something very new and very important. And this is the way we will illustrate it. The subconscious and the conscious mind are simply divided. This we will call the conscious mind. Now, the subconscious mind is very deep. And these, I will tell you everything I draw. These are stairs. And down here is the basement. In this basement is what Freud calls id, I-D, id. Id in Latin, to use the Latin expression, means that. Just that. At the top of the stairs is a censor. It's the only man I can draw. And he has a club in his hand. Now, down in this subconsciousness, down in the id, there are a number of drives, instincts, urges, and inclinations. Basically, they are the will to pleasure. More commonly, the sex instinct. Now, these instincts that we have try to get upstairs into consciousness. But moral taboos, convention, society, commandments and the like, repress them. And as soon as one of them comes up, censor cracks it over the head. The result is that down here in the id are a number of our repressed thoughts. And it's very much like our own cellar. We open the cellar door and throw down old papers and junk and discarded elements. Where does this id come from? Is it made up solely of the thoughts that we repress? No, not solely, because where did we get this instinct of ours? Everybody has it. So this id, and much that is in it, and this is important, came from the outside. The outside. First of all, it came from our environment. We would never have anything in our heads we had not seen or touched or smelled something. And then another psychiatrist by the name of Carl Jung said that down in the subconsciousness there was also what he called the myths of the human race. He called it the collective unconsciousness. But the point is, they come from the outside, though they are here in the id. Now, whenever we speak of the unconsciousness, we always think of it in those terms, in particularly Freudian terms, because he has popularized the idea. Haven't we anything else down there besides that? I think we have. Now let me test you. I'm going to use a word, and I'm going to give you a few seconds to allow you to develop your thoughts. The word is temptation. You thought of something dirty, didn't you? Yes, you did. You were thinking of something nasty, something you shouldn't be doing. Why? Why, as soon as we use the word temptation, do we always have to think of something wrong? Well, partly from this emphasis, partly that. Aren't we ever tempted to do anything good? Didn't you ever have an inspiration, for example, to be kinder to people? Hasn't a husband had an inspiration to be more kind, for example, to his wife? Rich man, maybe he ought to give some of his money to the poor. And another one is tempted to be more patient under trials. Then he received all kinds of inspirations to be better. For example, to be temperate, giving up excessive drinking and so forth. Isn't that true? Why does that word temptation have the monopoly of those things that, well, we say we're thrown down into the cellar part of our lives? Now, I want to suggest that in the subconsciousness, there's another treasure. So, here we have exactly the same planes of the mind divided, and at the top is the censor, and he's got a club, and these are the cellar stairs going down, but there's something good down here, and I have to give it another name. Now, Freud gave a Latin name to this, the id, so we're going to use a Greek name. And this thing that is down here is called, we're going to call it the pneuma. The Hebrews would have called it ruah. If we take just this side of the subconsciousness, and it's very true and real, then we have only just the earth and sand and mud. But isn't there something in the earth besides mud and dirt and sand? Gold and silver is hidden there. Aren't there wine cellars in a basement as well as rubbish? And sometimes garbage? Do we not have good thoughts? As well as we have very evil thoughts? Now, where do these thoughts come from? These inspirations? Well, the id came from the outside. As we said, our experience, our environment, our animal ancestry, heritage of the human race, collective unconsciousness, call it whatever you please, and adopt whatever theory of psychiatry that you please. So too, the inspirations, the good thoughts, another kind of temptations, pass through this subconsciousness. And this pneuma, too, comes from the outside. It operates on the inside, yes, but it comes from the outside. I'm not going to say where it comes from. It's just from the outside. Now, it sends up not just, for example, a will to pleasure. It sends up a will to happiness, a will to meaning, a will to peace. And what does the censor do now? Oh, the censor, as this censor will sometimes repress the things that are dedicated only to carnal pleasure, so this one is going to repress all the good temptations. And he's got really 7 clubs up there. One is pride, and the other is covetousness, lust, anger, envy, gluttony, and sloth. They're all up here, and he tries to keep them down. Just as Freud said, the superego tries to keep down these sexual desires. All right, then there are treasures in the subconsciousness which are worth studying. We're going to emphasize, first of all, that these come from the outside. Now, my angel is going to clean off the blackboard. Be careful of the stairs, Angel. Be careful of the stairs. Apropos of the pneuma entering into our lives, I read just a short time ago a newspaper item of an incident in Los Angeles. It seems that this truck driver, who was on a highway traveling about 40 or 50 miles an hour, saw before him a carton box, not very large. He said every carton box that he ever saw on a highway, he always ran over. He said he took a kind of a delight in running over a carton box and crushing it. He said it gave him a sense of power. When he saw this carton box, he said he swerved his truck violently to the side to avoid it, pulled up on the side of the road, went back to the carton box. What was in it? A 3-year-old boy who had crawled into the box and was making his way across the highway. And they said to him, "What made you do it?" He said, "I don't know what made me do it. I haven't any idea. I don't know where it came from." He said, "Maybe it was God. I don't know." How often, for example, a soldier in battle, and we hear of many such instances where he will suddenly get out of his trench or comparative safety in a trench, make his way out to the battlefield under fire of the enemy in order to rescue a buddy. He's given great praise for it. What will he generally say? He would generally say, "Anybody else would have done it." "Well, why did you do it?" "Well, the thought just came to me that I should." Now, this was something that was not part of the soldier's life, as it was not part of the truck driver's life. But it influenced him. One day, I was visiting a Carmelite convent of nuns, and they are cloistered. But this particular day, it was a very rare day. They had opened the cloister to visitors. And one of the very wealthy men of the town came in to visit the sisters, and in company with many others, they went up on the roof. And from the top of this convent, they could look down over the city. There was, first of all, a gully. And then far off was a hill. And on the hill, a beautiful mansion. And one of the party of this rich man said, "Sister, just suppose that before you came here to lead this life of penance, suppose you could have lived in that home and had all the wealth, the prestige, the sociability and gaiety that goes with it. Would you have left it for this?" She says, "That is my home." "Why did you do it?" She said, "There was always something inside of me that was welling up into my conscious mind that told me that I should do this, and I would be happy, and I am happy." So there is something else in our subconscious mind, therefore, besides the base And it is a pity that we always have to think of temptations as being solicitations to the things that are wrong, when there are many and many more that are solicitations to what is right. We resist probably more temptations to goodness than we ever do to badness. I'm sure we do. All of us. We give way to the id far more than to the pneuma. Of course, it costs something to obey the pneuma because you generally have to surrender something. Now, what does this pneuma do when it gets into us? Well, let me see. If I took a tennis ball and I rolled it across the table here, that tennis ball would go in a straight line unless it were diverted by a superior force or by my hand. So too, when we are going in a certain direction, we continue in that direction unless some superior power diverts and changes us. And what does it generally is this pneuma, which has the character of love. It introduces a new love. Like a boy that I knew of, he had dirty fingernails, he hardly ever washed his face, he would come to table with dirty clothes. The parents begged, coaxed, pleaded, tried to bribe. Nothing would ever induce him to give up his dirty clothes and dirty habits until one day, he went out, he didn't slam the door. He closed it gently. And the next day, he came down dressed, collar and tie, neat, fingernails clean. What had happened? He met Susie. Susie changed everything in his life. And that's something like the pneuma. And the pneuma introduces a Susie into our lives. And because it's a new love, we completely change. Now, take, for example, the case of Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist. Tolstoy was at a point of committing suicide. And this is a further illustration of the idea that I have just mentioned, namely, that we continue in a line of evil and despair and hopelessness and so forth, unless this power comes in from the outside. Tolstoy said that. I felt that something had broken within me on which my life had always rested, that I had nothing left to hold on to, and that morally my life had stopped. And invincible force impelled me to get rid of my existence in one way or another. And yet, while my intellect was working, something else in me was working too, and kept me from the deed. A consciousness of life, as I may call it, which was like a force that obliged my mind to fix itself in another direction and draw me out of my situation of despair. During the whole course of this year, when I almost unceasingly kept asking myself how to end this business, whether by the rope or by the bullet, during all that time, alongside of all of those movements of my ideas and observations, my heart kept languishing with another pining emotion. I call this by no other name than the thirst of God. Now, you've had that experience too. Many, many times. We all have had. And it's unfortunate that psychiatrists have not treated this properly. The only psychiatrist that I know who has done it in a thorough fashion and integrated it well is Dr. Paul Tournier of Switzerland. He understands that the consciousness has other depths, far more profound than those of which we've spoken. So that our lives until this pneuma comes is something very much like a flattened Japanese lantern. Then the lantern is opened, a candle is put into it, and immediately reveals patterns and design and harmony. And so when this pneuma begins to take possession of our lives, we change. We have the same eyes at night as we have in the day. Why can't we see at night? Because we lack the light of the sun. And so this pneuma is a light. It illumines our intellect. It's a power. It gives strength to our will. It's a power. It changes our direction. And maybe it might be a good thing if we all resisted a few more temptations of the id and began to have the beautiful experience of accepting the temptations of the pneuma.
Bishop Sheen will return in a moment.
Fulton J. Sheen is indeed a man for all seasons. He walked a paced beat, allowing us to glimpse his nature and ponder its worth and to enjoy its presence. Bishop Sheen authored over 90 books. He broadcast countless radio and television programs and ministered in many parts of the world to people of every belief. As he said many times, it is not a unity of religion we plead for, but a unity of religious people. We may not be able to meet in the same pew, but we can meet on our knees.
I have not told you what the pneuma is, have I? I'm not going to tell you. Because you've had it all your life. I want you to think about it and find out for yourself. Bye now. Bye, and God.
On the subject of character. And in some such outline as this. First of all, we will speak of the possibility of developing and changing a character, and secondly, the rules for developing a character, either in ourselves or others. First rule is character is in the will, not in the intellect. Secondly, as regards others, look for the best. That is to say, in others. Third rule, look for the worst in ourselves. First of all, the possibility of character. I believe every single person in the world has just a certain amount of energy, and some are much more richly endowed than others with it. If we use an example from physics, we might say that certain people, for example, have what might be called 10 ergs of energy. They have just that much. And then others have 20 and others have 50 ergs of energy. The result is that they're able to go in the direction of goodness, and they're able to go in the direction of evil too, with much greater rapidity and energy than others. And this energy, as I say, is not the same in every human being. I think that possibly any sinner is capable of being a great saint. And any saint is also capable of being a great sinner. Now let us give an example here of how this energy works. We say, first of all, some have little energy and they go in the direction, call this goodness. They have 10 units of energy here, and they only go in this much, either toward goodness or toward evil. Others have 20, and they go much more, either in the direction of goodness or the direction of evil. So that a person who has a great tendency toward evil can completely change and become very good, particularly with the grace of God. I believe that Lenin, who did so much to establish communism in Russia, just barely missed by a hair's breadth of becoming a St. Francis of Assisi. If he had only gone in the other direction, the direction of goodness, instead of the direction of revolution and hate, he would have been a great saint. And if St. Francis of Assisi had gone in the opposite direction, as he had gone in the direction of virtue, he would have been a Lenin. The secret, therefore, of character development is the realization of this power that there is in each and every one of us, for good and for evil. The monasteries, the religious houses, the places of asceticism throughout the world have in them actual saints, but potential devils. Any one of those persons, because they have so much character, if they ever let themselves go in the direction of pride, lust, or avarice, would become very vicious. And the penitentiaries are filled with individuals who have this great energy. And if someone could only lay hold of it and make them take the high road instead of the low, they would be our saints and our heroes and our great patriots. The point that I want to make is there's nothing wrong with passion and energy and strength, so long as it is properly channeled. Notice that our divine Lord, for example, when he wished to make a great apostle, laid hold of a bigot. Paul was one of the greatest bigots that ever lived. And only he who could ever hate like a Saul could ever love like a Paul. Our blessed Lord never extinguished, for example, the passions of a Magdalene. Only someone who was as vicious and as evil as Magdalene would ever become as virtuous as Magdalene. She has been called the 13th apostle. Her life has been such an inspiration in bringing men to goodness. Now, though some of us do not have as much energy than others, let us not forget that a person with only 10 units of natural energy can surpass a person with 100 units of natural energy if he calls upon God for an added source of energy, which God will give him on certain conditions. Then we can overcome all of the defects of our nature. And that power or energy of God is given freely, gratis. That is why it is called grace. Which brings us now to the rules for character development. One of the first rules of character training is to remember that character is in the will and not in the intellect. The intellect, or the brain, or the mind, is the seat of knowledge. The will is the seat of choices, loves, motives, and responsibilities. Almost all of education today is directed to the communication of knowledge and not to the development of character. It is the mind that is trained, rather than the will that is developed. And every decision that we make, every deed that we perform, almost every word that we say, goes into the making of our character, either for good or evil. You remember seeing icicles form? And a drop would fall upon the tiny little icicle and add to its substance and its quantity, and then more drops. And if the drops that fell were pure, the icicle itself would be pure. If the drops that fell were soiled and dirty, the icicle itself would be dirty. And so it is with character. All of our decisions pour down into its making. And if they're good acts, we turn out to be a good character. If they are evil, we turn out to be unhappy and frustrated and full of anxieties and fears. This will of ours is really the only thing in the world that is our own. God can take anything else away from us. He can take away our health, any wealth or possessions that we might have. The one thing that he leaves us, always our own, is our will. And people today really do not want their will. They do not want their freedom. That sounds strange, but it is true. The tendency today is to shift responsibility for decisions onto something else. For example, a boy does something wrong, and they say, well, it's due to grade B milk, insufficient playgrounds, or those naughty ductless glands. Child itself is hardly ever to blame. The present tendency in the world today, actually, is to reduce all responsibility to something which is subhuman. For example, Marx says that we are what we are because of economic conditions. In other words, our free will amounts to naught. Responsibility has been nullified. The Freudian tradition, for example, would say that to a large extent we are not economically determined, but biologically determined. And then it is felt that if we can ever bring to the surface something that is hidden down here, just bring it to the surface, that we will be cured and we'll be good and normal. No, that does not follow. It does no good to analyze the constituency of the water that gets into a sinking ship. You do not explain the oak simply by analyzing the rotten acorn from which it came. The real seat of character is here in the will. And we must not surrender that responsibility to the masses, as Marx would have it, or to any kind of biological determinism. Because if our will is determined by forces outside of ourselves, we no longer will make amendment for our misdeeds. And no character will ever grow without a constant resolution toward amendment. Character, as a matter of fact, is made by very severe discipline. You've seen a sculptor at work on marble, and the sculptor will first of all take a heavy chisel, and then will cut away great, huge chunks of marble. And then with more delicate blows, he will begin to bring out the image until finally perhaps all that is needed to reveal it is just the brush of a hand. And in the training of character, we have certain tendencies in us that are evil, that have to be every now and then repressed. And no one single blow or act will do it. And we have to take this mallet of our will, this chisel of our determination, and we knock off huge, great chunks of selfishness. And then later on, with more refined detachment and asceticism of the spirit, we finally come to a point where our character is really revealed and we appear as we ought to be and as God intended us to be. So rule number one then is character is in our will. Rule number two, and this applies to character training in others, we must always look for the best that is in others. When people are down because they have sinned, because